On August 9th, 1989, 23-year-old Duncan McPherson pulled his little red car into a parking lot inside of a lush green valley in Austria. After parking his car, Duncan reached across his middle console and he grabbed an apple out of a bag, and then he took a bite and just admired the unbelievable landscape all around him. He was near the Austrian Alps, and so there were literally just mountains jutting up everywhere. Duncan, who was originally from Canada, had been this highly touted, unbelievable first-round draft pick by the New York Islanders back in 1984. The Islanders are a professional ice hockey team in the United States. But despite Duncan's incredible promise and athleticism, he just couldn't ever get it together, and so he never actually made the New York Islanders' big league roster. And so, in 1989, Duncan started to realize that maybe his hockey career was coming to an end. But instead of just hanging up his skates in frustration, Duncan decided he would pursue a different type of career that kept him still within the hockey world. He would become a coach. And so, in 1989, Duncan had agreed to coach this small-time professional hockey team in Scotland. And for Duncan, his thought was, I'll go there, I'll learn how to be a good coach, and then down the road, I'll maybe have the opportunity to coach much more prominent and prestigious teams. But before moving to Scotland and beginning this new career, Duncan decided what he really needed right now was just to take a break. Because for basically his whole life, Duncan had been playing hockey around the clock, practically 7 days a week. You don't get to become a first-round draft pick unless hockey is your life. And so Duncan thought, you know what, before I begin this huge life transition, I'm going to just kick back and relax and go on a huge European vacation. And one of the first stops of this vacation was going to be the Austrian Alps right in front of him. However, he wasn't just going to look at these incredible mountains. He was going to snowboard down them. Or more specifically, he was going to learn how to snowboard on these incredible mountains. And so Duncan finished eating his apple and then chucked the core into the bag, and then he hopped out of his car, shut the door, locked it, and then began walking across the parking lot towards the white gondola station. A gondola is like a ski lift, but much bigger. It's kind of like a small bus with lots of windows, and it's connected to a cable, and that cable, which is elevated off the ground, pulls you up and down mountains. Now, typically, people ride gondolas just for the incredible view of the mountain from up high. But some gondolas are actually in place to take people to specific locations in the mountain. And typically these locations are areas that are not accessible otherwise. You need a gondola to get there. And in Duncan's case, the gondola that he was about to hitch a ride on was of the latter variety. It carried passengers from the station near this parking lot high up into the Austrian Alps, up to about 10,000 feet of elevation, where there was another gondola station called the Eisgrot Mountain Station. And right next to the Eisgrot Mountain Gondola Station was a very unique ski resort called the Stubai Glacier. And overwhelmingly, this ski resort was the reason why people were taking this gondola. This ski resort was unique not only because it was very hard to get to, you basically had to take a gondola or hike up to it, but also because the actual slope that skiers and snowboarders would use at this resort was not just a snowy mountainside like virtually all other ski resorts around the world are. No, instead, the Stubai Glacier Ski Resort was a glacier. And so people were literally skiing and snowboarding on a glacier, hence the name. And a glacier, in simple terms, is just a huge swath of thick, permanently frozen ice. And so, in the warmer months, when other ski resorts around the world were not able to continue operations because there was no snow or it was too warm to make snow, the Stubai Glacier Ski Resort did not have that problem, because in those warmer months, they could just drive their huge snowcat tractors with their big rakes behind them all over the slope, the glacier, and their rakes would basically chop up the top layer of the ice, turning it into powder for people to ski on, which allowed them to basically stay open every day of the year. And so Duncan, back down in the parking lot, He walked over to the gondola station, he bought his gondola ticket, and then he hitched a ride on the first gondola that swung through the station. And after a slow but beautiful ride up into the mountains, where all that lush greenery down below in the valley was replaced by jagged snow and ice up in the Alps, Duncan finally saw the Stubai Glacier ski resort and the glacier itself right behind it that stretched up to the top of the mountain. A few minutes later, the gondola Duncan was on arrived at the Ysgrot Mountain Gondola Station, and Duncan, along with the others inside of the gondola, hopped off, and then Duncan immediately walked over to the resort and headed into the equipment rental store. And after getting his snowboard and his boots and all the other equipment he would need, he headed right back outside to wait for his instructor to arrive. Duncan had previously purchased a lesson with an instructor at the resort. It was set for 11 a.m. And so Duncan, he's out there at the foot of this glacier, and right at 11, an instructor walks over and introduces himself, and Duncan and the instructor immediately start getting into the basics of snowboarding, how to put your boots into your bindings, how to use the edges of your board. And then for a little while, the instructor and Duncan didn't go up the glacier. Instead, they just kind of worked on some basics on the flat ground right there. And then after the instructor felt like Duncan was ready to go, they both walked over to the tow rope, which is a way to get to the top of the slope. There's a cable that kind of rotates from the top to the bottom of the mountain, and there are all these bars attached to the cable, and skiers and snowboarders grab the bar while standing on their snowboard or their skis, and they literally get pulled up the mountain. And so Duncan and the instructor grabbed onto the tow rope, they made their way to the top of the glacier, and from there they pushed over to the start of the run. And once they were there, the instructor strapped into his snowboard, and then Duncan strapped into his, and then they were off, very slowly making their way, kind of like a falling leaf pattern. Duncan was not just going straight down the mountain, he's a beginner, and so it's very slow, very controlled. And as they went down, the instructor's giving Duncan tips, how to stay more on his edge, how to slow down, how to speed up. And very quickly, the instructor saw that Duncan was so good at balancing, his legs were so strong, likely because he was a professional hockey player. And so the instructor was telling Duncan the whole time they're going down how unbelievably good he was doing for his first lesson. And so finally, after about an hour of very slowly making their way all the way down this glacier, they reached the bottom where they had first been doing some flat ground stuff. And when they got there, it had started to rain. And it was raining bad enough that lots of people on the mountain were abandoning the mountain and running inside of the resort to get out from under the rain. And so the instructor, he looked at his watch and he realized they were almost at 1 p.m., which was the end of their lesson. And he said to Duncan, I don't think we have time to go back up, plus it's raining. Duncan said he didn't care about the rain, but he also understood that, it wasn't ideal conditions. And so they decided that even though there was a few minutes left, they would just cancel the lesson right there, and they would actually just go inside and grab lunch together. And so they made their way out of the rain into the resort, and when they went inside the resort, the instructor noticed that Duncan's sweater, which was underneath his yellow rain jacket, was totally soaked. And so he offered to Duncan, hey, do you want to take your sweater off and I'll hang it up inside my office, and by the end of the day, it should be dry. And Duncan thought, great, that's fine. So he took off his wet sweater, he gave it to the instructor, and while the instructor was going to his office, Duncan went into the gift shop and he just bought a new sweater for the day. And after that, Duncan had his new sweater on with his rain jacket over it, and then he met the instructor in the cafeteria where they both sat down and had a nice meal. They got to know each other a little bit better. After they were done eating, both of them looked out the window and saw the rain had subsided, but in its place was lots of fog that was rolling in, and so very few people were going back onto the mountain. But the instructor told Duncan that, hey, you did so good today that you should really go back out there on your own this afternoon and practice. Do some runs, go nice and slow, same as I was teaching you, and then tomorrow, when we have our follow-up lesson, we can maybe, get into some more advanced things. Duncan thought that was a great idea. He said he would definitely go out there and practice on his own. And then the two men cleaned up, and the instructor made his way to meet his next client, and Duncan headed right outside, grabbed his snowboard, and began walking towards the tow rope. Last week, me and old Seagull Lung were wandering through Montreal when we turned onto this side street, and immediately we both stopped because right there in the middle of the road, laying unclaimed, was a fresh blue whale carcass. Now, Lung and I knew it was only a matter of time before somebody else came along, spotted this incredible treasure, and took it for themselves. And so without any hesitation, me and old Seagull Lung whipped out our portable meat smokers, and we got to work. And 99 hours later, our pockets were filled to the brim with glorious smoked street whale. However, when we tried to feed our smoked street whale to our friends and family at our annual summer barbecue, they took one bite and said, "This is kind of gross. What is this, smoked street whale?" And so, naturally, we were crushed by this, but luckily, we had a backup. HelloFresh. HelloFresh is America's #1 meal kit. From chef-crafted seasonal recipes to their new Fresh and Fit summer menu, HelloFresh brings flavor right to your doorstep. And don't worry if you're a terrible cook, because HelloFresh's foolproof recipes are super easy to follow and all their ingredients come pre-portioned. And speaking of their amazing ingredients, they travel from the farm to your doorstep in less than 7 days for quality you can literally taste. So if you're worried about your Montreal smoked street whale not being a hit at your next summer barbecue, well, save yourself the embarrassment and try HelloFresh. Go to HelloFresh.com and use code MrBallen50 at checkout for 50% off plus free shipping. Again, use code MrBallen50 at checkout for 50% off plus free shipping. Okay, back to the story. The next morning, Duncan's snowboard instructor arrived a little bit early to work. And so after getting off the gondola, he made his way over to the resort and he grabbed a cup of coffee in the same cafeteria where he and Duncan had eaten the day before. And then after finishing that coffee, the instructor grabbed his snowboard and the rest of his gear and then headed outside to meet Duncan in the meeting spot they had both agreed on. But when it was time for the lesson to start, Duncan didn't show up. And so the instructor, for a second, thought, was there somewhere else we were going to meet? Did I get the time wrong? But he checked the time and he remembered the conversation he had with Duncan. They were going to meet at the foot of the tow rope and he was right there and Duncan wasn't. And so he thought, okay, maybe Duncan's running late. But he waited and waited and waited and Duncan never showed up. The instructor was bummed because he and Duncan really had kind of become friends the day before, and he was looking forward to teaching Duncan some more today, but the instructor knew it was pretty common for tourists to cancel their follow-up snowboard or ski lessons. It's like they show up for that first day, they get really into it, they plan on going the next day, but then other distractions in their vacation pull them elsewhere, and they no-show for the lesson. And so the instructor didn't take it personally. He just assumed that, Duncan had found something else to do that was more fun. But the instructor knew he would see Duncan again because Duncan's sweater was still sitting in the instructor's office. 1 week later, Duncan's parents, who were back home in Saskatoon, Canada, got a very unexpected phone call from the Dundee Tigers hockey team, which was the professional hockey team in Scotland that Duncan was going to go coach after this big European vacation. The team rep for this hockey team asked the parents if they knew where their son was because he had not shown up for his first day of work. And Duncan's parents, they immediately were like, that doesn't make any sense. He was so excited about this job. This is a really big deal for him. He would never miss the first day. And so the parents told the team rep that they would try to get in touch with Duncan, and as soon as they did, they'd be in touch with the team, and the team rep said they would do the exact same thing for the parents. However, after this call, the parents quickly realized that trying to get in touch with their son was going to be nearly impossible. They knew Duncan had gone on this big European vacation, but they didn't have his itinerary. They didn't know what countries he was going to, in what order. They really only knew that he was really excited and he was just going to be on vacation. That was kind of it. And remember, this is 1989. They can't just call Duncan. There weren't cell phones. They didn't have the easy modern ways that we all communicate instantly. And so the parents are like, who do we even call? Where do we go? What do we do? And so ultimately, even though this felt kind of dramatic at the time, the parents decided to file a missing person report with Interpol, which is an organization that connects police across international lines. However, the parents quickly learned that this missing person report was not going to become a high priority item for any police anywhere in Europe, because their son was 23, he's healthy, he's strong, he's smart, he's of sound mind, and really all that had happened was Duncan had missed a single day of work on the back end of a huge vacation. So there's lots of reasons why that could have happened. Maybe he extended his vacation. Yeah, it's not professional, but it's totally possible. Or maybe he doesn't want to take the job after all. Or maybe he's just running late. I mean, there's a lot of very logical explanations for why Duncan didn't show up. And so, in short, the parents were told that if you want to find your son right now and not just wait for him to reappear, well, you better go looking yourself. And without hesitation, that's exactly what Duncan's parents did. They packed up a couple of suitcases and they headed to Europe to go find their son. Because to them, it felt like something was wrong here and there was no time to waste. But again, the parents have no idea where their son would have gone in Europe. And so they don't really have a good starting point. They don't know who to talk to. But they just began chasing down every single seemingly insignificant lead they came across. And as they traveled all over Europe, they hung up thousands and thousands of flyers that showed their son's face, said he was missing, and here's a number to call if you know where he is. But despite these efforts, the parents really got nowhere. That is, until about a month into their search, when still they have not found Duncan, they have no idea where he is, they've chased down all these leads, they've all dead-ended. And at this time, the parents convinced several news outlets around Europe to air a segment on their news about Duncan. And one of those missing person segments aired in Austria. And the news anchor in Austria, when they were doing this segment, they described the car that Duncan was almost definitely driving when he went missing. It was that little red car. The parents had discovered in chasing down their leads that their son had borrowed the little red car from a childhood friend who used to play hockey with him, and the friend had told the parents that he had lent it to Duncan, and Duncan had told him he would have it for a week and then return it. But Duncan had never returned the car. And so the anchor in Austria does this segment about how Duncan is missing, and if you have information, come forward. They describe the little red car, and sure enough, not long after this segment aired in Austria, somebody found Duncan's car. It was still sitting in that parking lot right near the Stubai Glacier gondola. Immediately, when Duncan's parents heard about this, they flew to Austria and they met with police who brought them out to look at their son's car. They hadn't moved it. It was still just sitting where he had left it. And then also police showed the parents what they had found inside of the car, which included Duncan's passport, a letter to his girlfriend, where he talked about how excited he was to go to Scotland, and also a bag of rotten fruit. The police also told the parents that now, with the discovery of this vehicle, they were going to really lean into this missing person case to try to find their son, and that the next day they were going to launch this huge search of the area near where his car was to hopefully find Duncan. And so the parents, who were now cautiously optimistic that they might get some answers, they left the police and they went to a local hotel to rest up before the next day when they would be up early and join this huge search party. But when they got to that local hotel, they did what they always did everywhere they went in Europe. They began handing out all these missing person flyers with Duncan's face on them to everybody they saw in the lobby. They began hanging them up all over the hotel. And sure enough, just by completely random chance, they handed one of these flyers to Duncan's snowboard instructor. They handed it to him, he looked at it, and he did a double take, and he was like, I know him. And he explained how he taught Duncan how to snowboard, and then Duncan didn't show up the next day, and he just figured, okay, he blew it off to go do something else, but he'd come back for his sweater, but he never came back for his sweater, and he never heard from Duncan again. And so the parents, they have been searching all of Europe for a month, and they haven't talked to anybody who knew Duncan. They've gotten nowhere, and now they've just randomly stumbled on probably the last person to see Duncan before he went missing. And so they kept asking the instructor, give us more information. What was his attitude like? Was he stressed out? Was he scared? Was he worried about something? Where did he go? Give us anything. But the instructor really didn't have that much more information to offer. And so he tried to answer all their questions, but really just finally said, look, I'm sorry. All I know is after we ate lunch together on the 9th, Duncan said he was going to go out and do some practice runs, but I never actually saw him go up. I didn't see him come down. I just assumed he went up there and was kind of on his own for the day. And then, of course, the next day I didn't see him and he never came back. And so I'm sorry. That's all I know. And so the parents finally said, thank you so much for the information. Please get in touch with us if you remember anything. And the instructor said he would. And then after that, the parents made their way to their room and they went to bed. The next morning, the parents got up early and they headed to that parking lot where Duncan's car was. And there were all these people, police officers and volunteers that were there to be a part of this big search party. And so after the parents explained to the leaders of the search party what the instructor had told them, that very likely their son had been up at the Stubai Glacier ski resort when he went missing, the entire search party quickly hopped on gondolas and made their way up there. And all day, this search party combed this glacier up and down. They walked all around to the backside of this mountain. They rappelled down cliffs and they hiked all over this entire segment of the mountain. But nobody found anything that gave away where Duncan had gone. And the next day, it was the same story. Huge search party looking everywhere, expanding the search, not just Stubai Glacier, but basically all over this entire swath of mountain range. But still, they found nothing. And so at the end of the second day, the authorities went up to Duncan's parents and they told them that unfortunately, we can't continue this search. We're calling it off. But Duncan's parents, they didn't call off the search. They continued searching for another 14 years. And over that time frame, they went back to Stubai Glacier over and over and over again. They searched it up and down. They knew all the staff members. They knew all the nooks and crannies of the entire place, but they never found any sign of their son. Fast forward to July of 2003, so 14 years after Duncan had gone missing. And a Stubai Glacier ski resort employee was riding the tow rope towards the top of the mountain when they noticed there was a bright yellow piece of trash right in the middle of the slope. And so the employee rode the tow rope just a little bit higher, and then he let go and skied down to this yellow thing. He reached down and he began pulling on this piece of yellow, and suddenly he stopped. And absolutely horrified, he realized this was not trash. While no one knows for sure what happened to Duncan, here is the leading theory that Duncan's family and authorities, for the most part, agree on. Back on August 9th, 1989, after having lunch with his snowboard instructor, Duncan was feeling motivated to go back out and take some practice runs. And so he headed outside, he looked up at the glacier, there's all this fog rolling in, but it's not raining, and so nobody's on the slope, and so it's perfect for a beginner. He's going to have this place to himself. And so he grabs his board, he makes his way over to the tow rope, he straps in, he grabs onto a bar, and he makes his way to the top. Once he gets off, he makes his way over to the start of the run, he puts his other foot into his binding, he makes sure he's all set, and then he stood up and began slowly kind of waffling his way down the completely vacant and very foggy slope. And as he was going along, he got more and more confident and began going a little bit faster and a little bit faster until finally he was basically just bombing it down the mountain, relying on his natural balance and strength to kind of keep him up. And then all of a sudden, he caught an edge and flipped forward and smashed into the ground. And when he did, he broke his leg. The unique danger to humans when it comes to glaciers is something called a crevasse. Basically, cracks form in the ice, and sometimes these cracks can be massive, like mind-bogglingly massive, hundreds and hundreds of feet, that if you fall into this thing, you're done. No one's getting you out of there. You are falling either to your death, or you're falling so far down that no one can get to you. Or, like in the case of Stubai Glacier Ski Resort, they had the issue of little crevasses forming kind of all over the place. Especially if it rained, the rain would begin to crack the ice, or if maybe it was warmer than usual, the ice would crack here and there. And so the resort was really good about constantly patrolling their slope to make sure no crevasses had formed anywhere on the slope. And so when you got to Stubai Glacier Ski Resort, you were warned that there is such a thing as a crevasse. This is a real glacier, so make sure you're looking around and don't fall into one. Well, because it had rained, a crevasse had formed, a small one, like a pothole, in the slope, but because it was so foggy because of the rain, as Duncan was bombing down, he didn't see it, and that's what he caught his edge on, causing him to fall and break his leg. And so Duncan, he's now stranded in the middle of the slope. He's not close enough to the bottom to where he could pull himself into the resort. He's not close enough to the top where he could get himself up there and talk to the tow lift operator. And so he's just kind of stranded. There's nobody on the mountain. It's so foggy, nobody can see him from the resort. and so he's just stuck in agonizing pain, wondering what he's supposed to do. At the same time this was happening, another ski resort employee was climbing into one of those big snowcat tractors at the top of the glacier. These tractors were what the resort used to chop the top layer of ice and turn it into snow. And because it had rained that day, a lot of the snow had melted, and so this employee needed to basically go over the entire slope from top to bottom and grind up the ice and make some new snow. And so the employee hopped in the cab of this tractor, shut the door, turned on the engine, turned on the back rake, which in your head, picture a long stretch of metal dragging behind this tractor that had rotating blades that cut into the snow as it moved along. And so this employee, after turning on the rake and making sure everything worked, they drove the snowcat and the rake onto the start of the downward slope, and they began crisscrossing back and forth across the entire slope, turning it all into fresh snow. And as this employee drove, they were very careful not to go too quick because they knew they couldn't see very far with all of the fog. And so they're going like 1 or 2 miles an hour, being very cautious. And then suddenly, at the last second, they see something in the snow. It kind of appeared out of the fog. And so the employees swerved as fast as they could to avoid hitting it. And they did narrowly miss it. Their big tank-like treads that are on these tractors just missed running this thing over. However, the back rake with the rotating blades did not miss this object. It went right over it. The employee immediately parked the snowcat and then leapt outside and ran over to see what this thing was. And when they got there, they could not believe what they saw. It was Duncan. And all those rotating blades that had crossed over him had basically mutilated him. One of his arms had been cut off, one of his legs was nearly cut off, but it's believed Duncan was actually not dead. The injuries were horrible, but they would not necessarily have killed him outright. He would bleed to death without help, but in theory, he could have been saved. But the employee, even though this was a total accident, totally panicked and decided that because it was so foggy, no one must have seen this. No one was around, and so no one would know that they were the ones who ran this guy over. And so instead of helping Duncan, they just tied him up and dragged him behind the snowcat off of the glacier over to this area where this employee knew there was a very deep crevasse. And they chucked Duncan, who might have been alive at this point, into the crevasse along with his arm and his severed leg, and then the employee used the snowcat tractor to rake over the crevasse. They filled it all in and packed it down, and then they drove down the rest of the way and just hoped no one would ever know. But over the course of the next 14 years, the glacier would melt more and more each year until finally Duncan's yellow jacket popped through the ice. And that's what the resort employees saw as they were going up the tow lift and thought it was trash. It was actually Duncan's jacket. They skied over, they tried to pull it out of the snow, only to then see, literally in the ice, Duncan McPherson looking right back up at them. And Duncan still looked like he was 23 years old because he had been frozen this entire time. According to the Stubai Glacier ski resort, Duncan must have just fallen into this crevasse and died. That's what they say happened, and some authorities say that is what happened. But when they pulled Duncan out of the ice and they found his body had been chopped apart and his snowboard had even been chopped apart, that told a very different story. As for the snowcat driver who drove over Duncan, they were never actually officially identified or charged with any crime because there was a statute of limitations that had run out by 2003. And so no one has ever been held accountable for Duncan's death. Carlos Camejo woke up freezing cold and totally confused. It was September 6th, 2007, and all Carlos could remember was being on his motorcycle with the hot sun bearing down on him as he wound his way on his bike through the streets of La Victoria, which is a city in Venezuela. Carlos tried to open his eyes, but he couldn't, and then when he tried to move his body, he couldn't do that either. And so he began to panic because he's paralyzed, but he told himself to calm down. If he couldn't move, at least he could think. He could try to process, what's going on here. There has to be an explanation for it. And so Carlos, in total darkness and immobile, began going through over and over again this whole motorcycle trip, which was his last memory. And he remembered that his friend had called him up and asked him to go out on this ride. Carlos used to go out all the time on his bike for fun with his friends and by himself, but now that he was 33 years old and married, he didn't have the time for it as much. But the weather had been so beautiful that when his friend had called and asked to go out, Carlos said, let's do it. And so Carlos began going over in his head the route that they had taken through La Victoria, and all he could remember was this long straightaway and then a right turn and then nothing. It was like after he made that turn, everything went blank. And as Carlos thought about how weird it was that one, he was paralyzed, and two, he had no memory of what happened after he made that right turn, he started to realize that he felt something against his back. It was like there was a block underneath his back, kind of right between his shoulder blades, propping his chest up, and he felt his arms kind of dangling down by the side, and it was very uncomfortable. And as he laid in this totally awkward position, he began to hear somewhere out in the ether unfamiliar voices just kind of chatting. And immediately, Carlos is like, okay, someone's here to help me. I don't know what's wrong with me, but somebody's here. I'm going to be okay. And soon, whoever was talking near Carlos had moved closer to him. And actually, Carlos began to realize that it was actually more than one person. It was at least two people talking back and forth. But again, Carlos can't open his eyes. He can't move. He can't communicate with these people. He just knows they've come closer to him. And after these people had moved right up against Carlos suddenly felt something metal pressing up against his chin. And it was kind of sharp, and it kind of hurt when it touched his chin. And Carlos wanted to scream out and tell them whatever they were doing to stop and at least tell him what was going on. But Carlos couldn't make a sound. And then Carlos began to hear this kind of mechanical whirring sound, like a machine starting up that was very close to where he was. And suddenly Carlos began panicking, like, what's going on? What are they doing to me? And as Carlos's heart rate is starting to speed up, one of the people who had moved near Carlos suddenly said, oh my God, that's impossible. This can't be. And then again, Carlos felt more pain in his chin. And then the pain got dramatically worse. It went from just kind of like a poking feeling to something going into his chin, and he felt it moving underneath his skin like a knife cutting through him, and then whatever it was, it went out of his chin. And as this is happening, Carlos is trying so hard to just wake himself up and do something to tell these people to stop, but he just couldn't do it. And then again, he felt that sharp pain in his chin, another round of something going into him, moving underneath his skin and then poking out again, and the pain became so blinding that suddenly Carlos was able to kind of break through this paralysis, and his eyes shot open. And for a second, all Carlos could see was like blinding lights. But then as things came into focus, he saw there were two people, the people who had been speaking, wearing these huge goggles and face masks, and one of them was holding a big needle with black thread attached to it, and that thread was coming from Carlos's chin. They had been running that needle through his face, stitching his chin for some reason, but with no anesthetic. And so as Carlos is staring up at these people in goggles, the people in goggles are looking down at Carlos, and they're totally horrified, and they just kind of begin backing up, not really sure what to make of this. And then Carlos, again, kind of breaking through this weird paralysis he was under, he was able to lift his head up and look down at his body. And he saw, to his horror, that he was totally nude. He was laying on a metal table, and there was this Y drawn on his chest, starting at his collarbones, coming down right underneath his throat, and then straight down across his chest. And then after Carlos saw this Y on his naked body, he looked over at a tray that was right next to this metal table near these two guys in goggles who were now kind of backing up, and he saw there was a whirring instrument on this table, and it was a circular blade, a saw. That was the sound he heard, and that's when Carlos figured it out. Earlier that day, when Carlos had been out riding his motorcycle with his friend, he had gone down that long straightaway in La Victoria, he had made a right turn, and parked illegally right after this turn was this big truck. Carlos didn't see it, and at full speed, he impacted the truck, he was thrown from his bike, smashed into the ground, horrific injuries, and when paramedics showed up, they pronounced him dead on the scene. And so he was moved from the scene of the accident to the morgue. And at the morgue, Carlos was stripped naked and put on this metal table, and they placed a block underneath his shoulders, kind of propping his chest up, and they drew a Y down the center of his chest for his autopsy. The two doctors that Carlos ultimately saw chatting and performing this autopsy were going to follow that Y on his body with the circular saw. That's how they cut you open during an autopsy. But right before they were about to do that, the doctors noticed that Carlos was actively bleeding from his chin. And since he was supposed to be dead, that didn't make any sense. And so that was why one of the doctors had said, oh my goodness, this can't be. And so not really sure what to make of it, they had just grabbed a needle and begun stitching his face together to stop the blood from going down his chest. And then Carlos opened his eyes, and it dawned on the two doctors that, oh, he's alive. That's why he's still bleeding. We should definitely take care of him now. But amazingly, after Carlos came back from the dead, he was simply moved into the hallway and left on this metal table, and the doctors who were going to perform his autopsy just left the paper that said he needed an autopsy in his pocket, just kind of showing that, hey, we were just following orders. Somebody told us to give you an autopsy. This is not our fault. And that's where Carlos stayed until his wife showed up and found him in the hallway, just laying there as if he was still just waiting for his autopsy. Carlos would suffer horrible injuries from the accident and serious emotional trauma from almost being cut open during this autopsy, but he would make a full recovery. On the afternoon of May 11th, 2015, 55-year-old Natalia was gathering sap inside of a Russian forest with her 82-year-old friend, Valia. The two of them had been coming to this grove of birch trees for many years. They enjoyed the peace and solitude of nature, and it was also a good place for Natalia to bring her little dog so he could run around while they collected the sap. It was a perfect spring day. The weather was very mild, the sun was out, and the two friends had a great time just kind of moving around the different birch trees, using their little drills and hammers to get their taps into the tree, and then they'd put their glass bottles underneath each tap to collect their harvest. And then at some point, Natalia felt like she had all the sap she would need, and she began gathering up her things to get ready to leave. And as she did that, she looked over at Valia, and she had found this really big birch tree, and she had sat down underneath it and was working hard to set her tap. And so as Natalia registered that Valia was over here, kind of doing one more tree before they left, she began looking around for her dog. And she found her dog, and he wasn't too far away from Valia, and he was just kind of moseying around one of the trees, when suddenly Natalia noticed the dog came to a hard stop, and it turned and looked deeper into the forest, like it had clearly registered something that had put it on alert that was out of view. And so Natalia, her view was obscured from whatever the dog was looking at, and so she put down her equipment and kind of moved between the trees to see what her dog was looking at. And at some point, her view cleared, and she saw pretty far off in the forest was something huge, this dark thing kind of moving behind the trees. And suddenly, it jumped out from behind the trees and ran towards the dog. It was a huge Russian brown bear. And so totally horrified, Natalia's watching this bear charge her dog. She looks over, she sees Valia, who's pretty hard of hearing, is sitting with her back to this bear and the dog, still just working on this tree. And Natalia's just frozen for a moment, having no idea what to do. And then instinct suddenly took over, and Natalia just turned and began running away, leaving Valia and leaving the dog. But after only running several paces, she stopped and turned around and saw the bear is still trying to attack the dog, but the dog is standing its ground and barking at the bear, which is kind of causing it to back up and be a little unsure of itself, even though this dog is so much smaller. And still Valia is not reacting at all. She has not heard the bear, the dog, nothing. And Natalia, she's looking back knowing that she needs to do something. She can't just let her friend and her dog get killed. And so Natalia began walking slowly back in the direction of this bear, and she began screaming at Valia to get up and run with her. But the second Natalia began screaming, the bear went from looking at the dog to turning and looking at Natalia, and suddenly it was like the dog meant nothing. The bear had decided it was going to go after Natalia. And so Natalia, she's staring at this bear, realizing, oh my God, it's going to charge me. But before she could even turn to run, the bear had ran at full speed and jumped at her. Natalia turned and she tried to run, but the bear bit down on her thigh, and she felt it crush her leg and pull her to the ground and whip her up against a nearby birch tree. And she's screaming and trying to pull herself herself away, but the bear is ripping at her leg, trying to yank her back into the forest. And then Natalia, she sees her little drill that she uses to set the tap in the trees, and she reaches out and she grabs it, and she turns, and her leg is being actively eaten by this bear. And she turns on the drill, and she's about to jam it into the bear's eye when the bear suddenly stands up to its full height and then just falls all its weight down onto Natalia's chest. And immediately Natalia dropped the drill and the bear clenched down on her throat. Now, at this point, Valia, who again is hard of hearing, she didn't know what was going on, she turned around and saw this bear mauling her friend. And so what does she do? She runs over to this bear, right behind it, and begins pummeling this bear and screaming at it to get off her friend. And the bear, who barely registers Valia hitting it, it just lets go of Natalia for a second, it turns around, and you gotta remember, this bear has been eating Natalia. Its face is covered in her blood, and it turns and looks at Valia, and Valia, she's terrified, she begins stumbling backwards, and the bear is clearly about to jump on Valia when Natalia, who's barely alive, she sees this happening, and she just begins screaming at this bear while she's laying there bleeding out, trying to attract the bear to come back and keep eating her to spare Valia. And it works. The bear, hearing Natalia screaming behind it, forgets about Valia and turns back around and resumes eating Natalia. And then just seconds later, the bear actually lifted up Natalia by her neck and it ran off into the woods carrying her. And so Valia is just left watching this happen. She knows she's not going to be able to stop this bear. And so she just begins running back towards the car, which was not that far from where they were. And when she got out there, she grabbed her phone and she called the authorities. About an hour and a half later, hunters sent by the police, along with animal control, arrived at this parking lot and they found Valia, who was totally in shock, and she would tell the hunters and animal control where this birch tree grove was, where all this happened, and a moment later, the authorities headed into the woods. And after arriving at the birch tree grove, they actually saw the bear. It was by itself, and it turned and looked at them, and it began charging them, and they all raised their rifles, and they fired at the bear. And they shot it enough times that the bear collapsed right in front of them, and then they shot it one more time to make sure the bear was dead. But there was no sign of Natalia anywhere. But then suddenly, the authorities turned and saw something move off in the distance, and out from behind a tree came Natalia's little dog. It had somehow not sustained any injuries from this bear, even though the bear had originally gone after the dog. And the dog, it came up to the authorities and then quickly doubled back behind a tree. And so, kind of operating on instinct, the group followed the dog around the tree, and they saw the dog was closely guarding this kind of mound that was covered in sticks and leaves and dirt. And so one of the hunters walked over and looked down, and they realized there was a person underneath this mound. It was Natalia. They pulled off all of the dirt and the twigs, and they found her absolutely destroyed, mauled body. But Natalia was actually still alive. Brown bears are notorious for eating their prey while they are still alive. And in many cases, they will gravely wound their prey, but not let it die, because then the meat is fresher when they come back and eat it later. And so bears will wound their prey and then basically bury them, cover them up with sticks and dirt, kind of like putting it in the fridge, and then come back and eat them later on. And so Natalia was earmarked to be eaten later because she was still alive and buried. Natalia was rushed out of the forest to a nearby hospital, and she would stay there for several weeks because she had serious injuries from this bear. All over her body were these huge bite marks, and a lot of the flesh from her leg had been pulled off. But amazingly, she would recover, although the trauma of nearly being eaten by a bear has never left her. Thank you to BetterHelp for sponsoring today's video. I grew up in a family where talking about our feelings was totally normal, and so as a result, I remember thinking that I would never be depressed because I'd be able to get ahead of whatever I was dealing with before it became a much bigger issue. But fast forward to 2017, when I had just left the military and I was trying to find my way in the civilian world, and suddenly I just felt mad all the time, even though I didn't know why. But instead of talking about my feelings to someone, like I had been raised to do, I just bottled that anger up, and eventually it turned into a full-blown depression. It turns out the reason I was able to talk about my feelings when I was a kid was because I wasn't really struggling, but as an adult, when I had real mental health issues, suddenly talking about what was going on with me felt impossible. Luckily, when I was struggling, my family noticed and they convinced me to go see a therapist, and truly it changed my life. So if you're struggling right now and you're just bottling up the way you're feeling, stop doing that and consider going to therapy. And a very easy entry point into therapy is BetterHelp. BetterHelp is a highly reviewed online therapy platform, which means you can get the help you need right from the comfort of your own home. Get matched with a BetterHelp therapist after filling out a brief survey, then you can talk to your therapist however you feel comfortable, whether it's via text, chat, voice, or video. You can also switch therapists at any time at no additional cost. Go to our sponsor, betterhelp.com/MrBallen for 10% off your first month of therapy with BetterHelp and get matched with a therapist who will listen and help. On the afternoon of May 25th, 2017, 42-year-old Nicole Gordon was laying on her couch in her home in Atlanta, Georgia, with an ice pack on her head. She had a blinding headache, one of the worst headaches she had ever had, and she was just unable to do anything else but lay on the couch. Nicole really had no idea why she had this terrible headache. The only thing she could think of was 3 weeks earlier, she had been in a minor car accident, and one of her car windows had broken, and some of the glass had cut her face, but she didn't think that would be enough to lead to this absolutely horrific headache that had not gone away for 3 weeks. But Nicole was a very tough woman, and even though she had thought about going to the hospital over these past 3 weeks to deal with whatever was causing this headache, she had told herself that, it's got to be something minor. I just need to kind of tough it out here. And what toughing it out looked like was laying on the couch all day long, only getting up to eat and go to the bathroom, not going to work, and just sitting in the darkness with this ice pack, just hoping for this headache to go away. And so as Nicole was just laying there, she heard her back door open up. It was her boyfriend, Durante, coming in with groceries. He came inside and he put the groceries away, and then he came into the living room where she was, and he asked how she was doing. And she told him that the headache had not gone away yet, and would he mind going into the kitchen and getting her some ibuprofen, which are pain meds, as well as some water. And so Durante said, of course. He went in the kitchen, he got what she needed, he brought it back. She said thank you, she took the ibuprofen, and then she went back to just being totally miserable. But just a second later, Nicole and Durante heard a knock at the front door, and Durante, he walked over and kind of casually looked through the blinds to see if he could see who was at the front door, and he saw it was Nicole's best friend, Leisha. But instead of going to the door and opening it, Durante turned to Nicole and said, hey, it's Leisha, do you want me to get the door? And Nicole, she just kind of grunted and said, no, please just ignore her. Even though Nicole and Leisha were very close, Nicole knew that Leisha was very high energy. She had been calling and texting basically nonstop ever since Nicole had begun getting these headaches. Leisha just wanted to help and kind of be around and be a part of her recovery. But Nicole just couldn't deal with that super high energy right now. She could barely have a conversation without her head hurting even more. And she knew that Leisha and Durante didn't really get along too well, and so Nicole figured it would just be better for everybody if they pretended no one was home and Leisha just went on her merry way. But Leisha was very persistent and just continued knocking really loud on the front door. She began calling Nicole's phone, and so Nicole began reaching over and silencing her phone over and over again. And finally, Nicole looked over at Durante and just said, I don't need this. I'm going into my bedroom and I'm lying down. And so she grabbed her phone, she stood up off the couch, she could barely move, her head hurt so bad, and she walked, quietly past the front door, made her way into her bedroom, and she was about to lay down on the bed when she made the mistake of opening up her blinds just a little bit. Her room was on the front of the house as well, and she wanted to see if Leisha was still there, and when she opened those blinds, Leisha, who was outside, happened to be looking at Nicole's bedroom, and the two of them made eye contact. And Nicole's like, oh my God, she knows I'm here. And so Nicole, she just shuts the blinds. But now Leisha comes up to the window and she's yelling, Nicole, I know you're there. Come on, let me in. I want to help you. But Nicole, she just could not deal with it. And so she laid down on her bed and just continued to totally ignore Leisha. Nicole knew that no matter how offended and upset Leisha was for this snub, she would get over it because the two women had been friends for nearly 2 decades. 19 years earlier, they had been neighbors, and they had become friends really quickly. They had been pregnant at the same time, and they began raising their kids kind of like side by side. But in the last 5 years that Nicole and Durante had been together, Nicole and Leisha had kind of drifted apart because Leisha and Durante both had very strong personalities and they just kind of clashed. And Nicole and Durante had this kind of on-again, off-again relationship, and every time they were broken up, Leisha would come around and be totally unfiltered with Nicole about how much she didn't like Durante. But right now, Nicole could just not deal with Leisha, and so despite hearing her yelling for her to come outside, come on, I know you're in there, Nicole just rolled over on her bed with her ice pack on the side of her head, and she fell asleep. A few hours later, when Nicole woke up, Leisha was gone, as well as Durante. He didn't stick around for very long. He often would only come over just to check in, and then he'd go off and do his own thing. And so Nicole, who still had this blinding headache, she sat up, she got out of her bed, and she was only able to walk back out into the living room, where she laid down on the couch and just went right back to sleep. Even though Nicole had had this headache for 3 weeks and it had not gotten any better, she really was convinced that taking enough ibuprofen and relaxing long enough would cause it to go away. But over the next couple of days, this headache, which was already like a 10 out of 10 on the pain scale to Nicole, somehow became like a 20 out of 10, and it got so bad that she couldn't even open her eyes. It was like horrific. And as this headache got so bad, her relationship with Durante started to sour. Durante didn't really believe that Nicole was actually in the amount of pain that she was in, and he kind of began acting like she was just being lazy. And this really upset Nicole because that wasn't true at all. She was just in blinding pain and couldn't do anything. Finally, in late June, so 5 weeks after Nicole's headaches had begun, and at this point, her headache had still not gone away, she was laying on the couch, like always, with the lights off, she's got the ice pack on her head, and she's just trying to get through the day when she hears the back door open, and it's Durante, and he comes in, he slams the back door, he doesn't even say hello, and he just storms into the living room and just looks down at her with a totally disapproving look. And Nicole, she kind of looked over at him, and when she saw that look on his face, she had just had it, and she said, you know what? We're done. And immediately Durante got so mad, and he's like, how dare you? I've been taking care of you for the past 5 weeks, bringing you groceries, this and that. And Nicole, she had no energy to fight with him, and so she just let him rant and rave until finally he was done, and he walked out, and she was like, thank goodness. A few days later, on June 25th, Leisha was back at Nicole's house, knocking on the door. Nicole had actually texted her to let her know that she had officially ended things with Durante, and so feel free to come over, there's not going to be any drama with him being here. And so Leisha had come back over. She was very excited to see Nicole and kind of get over the snafu of her being ignored. And when she knocked, Nicole did go up to the door and she opened it up. And Leisha, as soon as she saw Nicole, this is like the first time she's seen her since Nicole's headaches had really begun, she knew something was definitely wrong with Nicole. Her entire apartment is totally dark. All the windows are covered up. And Nicole is squinting out at Leisha, kind of beckoning her to come inside. And Leisha's like, oh my gosh, like how bad is this headache? And Nicole could barely make a sentence, and she just said, oh, it's so bad, it's so bad. And so Leisha came inside, and Nicole led her through the dark apartment to the kitchen and back. And Nicole, she sat down, and Leisha sat down opposite her. And Leisha began asking Nicole questions about her headache, about Durante, just kind of about her life. And quickly, Leisha realized that Nicole really wasn't making any sense. Her answers, even to the simplest questions like, what did you eat today, were in fragments and didn't really make any sense. And finally, Leisha said to Nicole, hey, this can't be a normal headache. This is something serious. You need to go to the hospital. And at this point, even though Nicole had been trying so hard to just kind of white knuckle her way through whatever was going on in hopes it would go away, she was starting to realize that there was something wrong here and she needed help from a doctor. And so Nicole agreed to go. And so Leisha would help Nicole up and kind of assist her out of the apartment and into Leisha's car, and Leisha would take her to the hospital. And when they got there, Leisha brought Nicole into the emergency room, and she explained to the nurses and doctors that Nicole had this terrible migraine. It started after she was in this minor car accident 5 weeks earlier. And so the doctors and nurses brought Nicole back to one of the rooms, and they began kind of treating her the way they would any other patient who had a serious headache. They asked her if she was hydrated. They asked asked what medication she was taking. They asked her what she was eating, how much sleep she was getting. They were just kind of going down the list of different things that could cause this headache, but nothing stood out as a red flag. Even the fact that she had been in this minor car accident and had some cuts on her face from the glass, that really wasn't enough for them to think, oh yeah, that would cause 5 weeks of a persistent migraine-like headache. They even looked at the cuts on her face to see if maybe they were infected or something, but they weren't. Basically, they had no idea what was causing this. But the doctors and nurses were very concerned because persistent, extreme pain in your head could be signs of a stroke or an aneurysm or something, both of which can be fatal. So they put Nicole through a series of imaging scans to get a look inside of her head to try to figure out what was going on. And after they finished all these scans, Nicole was brought back to her hospital room and she laid down on the bed. And even though she felt terrible still because of this headache, she at least felt like, okay, finally, these people are going to figure out what's wrong with me. They're going to give me medication. This headache's going to go away and I can get back to my normal life. But only a few minutes later, as Nicole is laying there trying to get comfortable, the door to her room suddenly burst open and a swarm of people came into the room looking very concerned. And in the middle of all these people was a guy wearing a suit, and he walked up to Nicole and he said he was a police detective, and he held up one of her scans and he pointed at it. But to understand what he was pointing at on her scan, we need to go back and look at what really happened on the day that Nicole got into that minor car accident. Back in early May of 2017, Nicole and Durante, who were still dating at this point, had just come back to Nicole's house after the two of them had been at a house party together. And Nicole was furious with Durante because at this house party, he had been openly flirting with another woman right in front of Nicole. And so Nicole, after going into her house, brought it up to Durante about how disrespectful that was. And Durante, instead of being apologetic or trying to defend himself or even lie about it, he actually just got really mad at Nicole and said, you know what, fine, I'm breaking up with you. And then he began going around her house, gathering up all of his things that he had left inside of her house. And Nicole, truthfully, was so mad that she didn't really care that he was putting on this show of taking his stuff and leaving her. And so after a few minutes of Durante angrily grabbing his stuff from inside the house, he headed outside to Nicole's car where he had some more things inside of her car. And so he went in the passenger seat, and Nicole, she just reflexively got into the driver's seat of the car just to make sure that Durante didn't take anything inside of her car that he shouldn't, or mess with her car in some way to get revenge on her. And so she's sitting there, she's watching Durante right next to her gather up his things, and then he hops out of the car, doesn't say a word to her, and then he walked around the front of her car and got into his car, which was parked right in front of hers, facing out towards the road. He climbed into the driver's seat, shut the door, and then he didn't move. And so Nicole, she's still sitting in her car, looking at Durante, hoping that he's just going to leave now, but he wasn't. And so suddenly feeling so frustrated and mad at him for everything, she turned on her car and drove forward, not fast or anything, and bumped intentionally into the back of Durante's car, and then she backed up to where she had been. And after she did that, she stared angrily at Durante, basically being like, what? Like, I want you to leave, like, get out of here. And Durante, he was furious. And so he threw his car in reverse and he really hit the gas and rammed into the front of Nicole's car. And in fact, he hit her car so hard that her car lurched backwards and smashed into her fence. Now, Nicole's memory only showed her this exchange. She remembered fighting with Durante, him getting his stuff, and then her bumping into him, and then him really hard smashing into her. And so when she thought about the minor accident she had gotten into, this was it. But what Nicole did not know as she was laying in the hospital bed, as this detective is holding up the scan and pointing at it, is there was actually a whole other series of events that played out after Durante backed into her. After Durante backed into Nicole and she smashed into her fence, Durante got out of his car, walked up to Nicole's car, drew a gun, and shot Nicole in the head. That's what happened. This was not a glass cut. This mark on her forehead was where the bullet went into her skull. But obviously, this did not kill Nicole. It knocked her unconscious, and Durante picked her up, put her in his car, and drove her to his mother's house, where he told his mother that, oh, Nicole was drunk and she got into a small accident and, she just needs to rest. And so Durante's mom, believing her son, put some Neosporin on Nicole's entry wound from the gunshot, put a Band-Aid over it, and kind of looked after her for the night. And then when Nicole came to, she had no idea what happened. Her memory only existed up until Durante rammed into her. She didn't remember him getting out and shooting her and all of that. And so when Durante realized that Nicole didn't know he shot her, he just went along with it and said, oh yeah, you got drunk and, we were fighting a little bit and you got into a small accident and I think the glass fell down and cut your head. That's all that happened. And Nicole believed it. It wasn't until Leisha made Nicole go to the hospital 5 weeks later and they scanned her head that they discovered a bullet lodged in her brain. And so the detective came in the room holding up the scan and he pointed to the bright spot on the scan and that was the bullet. And the doctors and nurses, they told Nicole that we've never seen anything like this, like you should be dead. And also because this has gone untreated for 5 weeks, your body healed around the bullet. Like we can't even take it out now. Your brain has formed itself around the bullet, and so it will do more damage than good if we try to pull it out. And so Nicole would go on to live her life with this bullet in her head, but she never really fully recovered. As for Durante, the police would very quickly go after him, but he would flee police and evade them for 2 years, and then finally when they caught up to him, he was hiding in an attic and there was this whole long standoff, but then finally he would surrender himself, and then he would get charged with a host of crimes, many of which he was convicted of, and so ultimately he was sentenced to 25 years in prison. So that's going to do it. If you got something out of today's stories, be sure to check out our podcast called the Mr. Ballin' Podcast, where we have literally hundreds more stories just like these that are available right now. Again, it's called the Mr. Ballin' Podcast, and it's available exclusively on Amazon Music.